All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Thomas Halverson, and I'm the Associate Director for Corporate and Foundation Relations at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to another session of MEI's virtual briefing series on the Israel-Hamas war and its ramifications, which will focus this week on the impending ground invasion of Rafah. Since October, MEI has been working to provide you with expert analysis on every dimension of the ongoing conflicts in the region post-October 7th. And we hope that we've been a valuable resource to you and your colleagues. This afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome two highly regarded MEI experts to this series. Eran Etzion is an MEI non-resident scholar with more than 20 years of experience in senior Israeli government positions. During his career, he served as both the head of policy planning at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the deputy head of Israel's National Security Council in the Office of the Prime Minister. Mirette Mabrouk is a senior fellow and founding director of MEI's Egypt and Horn of Africa program. In addition to her role at MEI, Mirette has held positions at the Atlantic Council, Brookings Institution, as well as several Middle East-based policy research institutes, and has 20 years of experience in print and television journalism. Thank you both for joining us this morning for this discussion.
Pleasure.
Earlier this week, Israel's War Cabinet member Benny Gantz declared that unless all Israeli hostages are released by the beginning of Ramadan on March 10th, Israel will launch an offensive in Rafah, one of the last remaining safe zones for civilians in Gaza. Today, Rafah contains an estimated 1.4 million Gazans, more than 5 times its population before October 7th, the majority of whom have fled from other war-torn cities out of fear for their lives. Meanwhile, Egypt has been clear that it won't tolerate the expulsion of more than 1 million displaced Palestinians into its territory. And satellite imaging suggested that Egypt has even begun construction on a buffer wall to keep Palestinians from flowing into Egypt. With the looming threat of invasion and a growing humanitarian catastrophe inside Gaza, Israel and its neighbors are scrambling to negotiate a path that addresses overlapping and often contradicting concerns. Before turning to our listeners for questions, I was hoping the both of you could provide some insight into how Israel and into how Egypt are thinking about this serious issue. First, what are each country's objectives, priorities, red lines, and non-negotiables when approaching the situation in Rafah? Second, to what extent is there coordination and coherence with each other and the broader international community when it comes to protecting the lives and livelihoods of Palestinians currently in Rafah? And third, how are domestic populations in Egypt and in Israel reacting to government policy on this issue today? And is the government addressing or ignoring the concerns of their people as they relate to the worsening situation in Rafah? I know that's a lot, but we'll try to answer all of that both in your opening remarks and then also in the questions to come. And Eran, I'd like to start with you, and I'd love it if you could respond to some of these questions with insight from the Israeli perspective.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I will first of all say that Rafah is obviously just one aspect of the Gaza war. And I would even argue not necessarily as important as perhaps some are trying to portray it, because there are much bigger issues that are at stake here, including the future of Gaza in its entirety, the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, indeed the very future of Israel, not in terms of whether or not it will exist, or even not necessarily in terms of its borders, but in terms of its nature, its values, its international profile, its place amongst the nation, and especially within the great battle between the democratic side of this universe and the autocratic side of this universe. All of these questions and more are actually being fought in Gaza and in Israel proper. So Rafah is just really one piece of a very, very intricate puzzle. Now, to focus on Rafah, I would say, first of all, the Israeli goal in Rafah is part of the bigger goal of eliminating Hamas's control of Gaza, eliminating Hamas's military capabilities, eliminating it as a viable political entity controlling Gaza, political, economic, in whichever way, and releasing the hostages, which Israeli intelligence believe at least some are being kept below Rafah, in the tunnels below Rafah. As far as the humanitarian side is concerned, those 1.4 wretched Palestinians who've been driven away from their homes, most of them, I would honestly say that it is not part of the Israeli calculation in the way that perhaps outside observers and some Israelis would like it to be. It is considered, quote unquote, as a I don't want to say negligible, but as a side effect of the military and political goals that need to be achieved. And some Israelis are even trying to use it as a lever, both on Hamas and on Egypt and on other interested parties, essentially saying, if you want to avert further humanitarian catastrophe, go ahead and release the hostages, go ahead and help us annihilate Hamas, and so on and so forth. So Israel is now kind of waving this threat of occupying Rafah in the hopes, I would say, this is not obviously being said as such by the Israeli authorities, but I would claim that at least some Israeli cabinet members and some in the defense establishment are looking at this potential invasion of Rafah as a lever or a card in the political and military game, rather than necessarily something that they would like to do in any eventuality. In other words, if, and we all know, and you said so yourself, there are ongoing negotiations on the hostage release and on the smaller deal that hopefully would evolve into a bigger deal, and we're all familiar with that, that the Americans are leading with the Egyptians, with the Qataris. So if there is a breakthrough in the negotiations, and there is an agreement either on the entirety of the negotiation scheme, or even on the first part of it, which essentially is freeing some 30 or 40 hostages in return for temporary pause of 30 or 40 days, 1 day per one hostage. If there is such an agreement, then obviously there will not be a change in the status quo in Rafah. And then in the negotiations that would ensue on the further steps that would be taken, hopefully within still a framework of an agreement, all options are open when it comes to Rafah, including, of course, that there will be no invasion whatsoever. Now, in terms of the coordination with Egypt, here too, it's pretty intricate, and Israel has been using it, using both, shall we say, positive and negative levers on the Egyptians. Some, as we know, in the Israeli cabinet have been either quite openly or more discreetly threatening the possibility of Gazans under pressure, essentially kind of storming the fence between Egypt and Gaza and entering into Egypt. Some have even proposed that Egypt opens the gates on its own and allows them in and builds temporary refuge for them, and so on. This is from the very early stages of the war, and it continues still. And Egypt reacted harshly. I'm sure Mirette will be able to explain why. It's pretty straightforward for everybody who knows anything about Egypt and Gaza. And of course, it was very well known to those Israelis who used this threat, but nevertheless, they still used it. So some of them used it because, as part of a bigger scheme to essentially drive Gazans out of Gaza. And some of them, the more, shall we say, moderate ones, pragmatic ones, were using it as a lever on Egypt to try and encourage Egypt to do more, both in terms of the negotiations, but also in terms of sealing the tunnels beneath the so-called Philadelphia corridor. And that's a point I'll say a few words on if I still have some time. As we all know, in the past, there have been anywhere from dozens to hundreds of tunnels underneath the so-called Philadelphia corridor. some of them purportedly wide enough for actual trucks and buses to go through. At some point, Egypt, under Israeli and American pressure, took action and dismantled, according to them, all of the tunnels, according to Israel, most of the tunnels. But as far as I understand what Israel thinks right now or assesses, there are still active tunnels underneath the Philadelphia corridor, which means that the Israeli war effort is in jeopardy because of that. Because, for example, high-level terrorists or even some hostages and certainly arms can flow either out of Gaza or into Gaza. And that obviously complicates the Israeli war effort. And then thinking about the so-called day after, if there is no way to seal Gaza off completely from the Egyptian side, it's only 14 kilometers, by the way, the Philadelphia corridor. If there is no way to seal it off, then what are we actually doing? It's only a question of time before, if it's not Hamas, it's Islamic Jihad. If it's not Islamic Jihad, it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatnot, we'll be able to rearm. And again, Gaza will become a platform, a threatening platform towards Israel. So that's a major, major issue for Israelis. And last, I would say that, again, I'm speaking now on looking at the more pragmatic side of the Israeli cabinet. There is such a thing. They understand that under whatever future of Gaza, Egypt will, even by default, play a very significant role, and potentially it can even play a critical role positively if there is to be any kind of a negotiated solution, any kind of a constructive rebuilding of Gaza, and all the more, shall we say, positive scenarios. Egypt can and should be a critical partner. And in order to do that, Israel needs to build trust with the Egyptians, convince the Egyptians on the highest levels, contrary probably to what they're convinced now, that there is actually a convergence of interests between Israel and Egypt, and not only a collision of interests. And that's probably a task for the next Israeli government, because relations between Netanyahu and Sisi, I think, are beyond repair. I can say a lot more about other third parties, but I guess my time is up, right, Thomas?
For now, yeah. We'll turn back to you in a bit, Eran. Thank you so much for providing that overview. Now I'd like to turn to Mirette. Mirette, can you please tell us how Egypt is thinking of all of this in light of an impending ground invasion?
Okay. I think Egypt is looking at this with increasing alarm. I mean, it's been alarmed from day one, but that alarm is just spiraling at the moment. I think Eran gave an excellent overview, and I think he highlighted some really important points. But it's on the Egyptian side, if I can tackle a couple of things. One, Egypt's quote unquote red lines, I think, haven't really changed. They've had a couple added to them. The first thing that Egypt has said that it's not going to have is an influx of Palestinian refugees into Egypt. Now, this question comes up a lot because people say, well, why doesn't Egypt just do the humanitarian thing and take them in? And I think as Eran, just lightly touched on, Egypt is worried about two things. One, it says it won't stand for another forced mass expulsion, because there is, I think, the feeling in Palestine, in Egypt, just about everywhere else really, that any Gazans who are forced out will never be allowed back in. And then two, there is for Egypt a definite security issue, which is sort of double-pronged. On the one hand, Egypt has maintains a working relationship with Hamas because of the unusual circumstances of this situation. but they are Islamist extremists, and Egypt is not big on Islamists. In fact, one of the things that they're currently worried about is that any introduction of Hamas back into the country, and you want to remember that Egypt just finished fighting an insurgency in North Sinai, is going to sort of reinvigorate the Muslim Brotherhood, which the current government in Egypt has been doing its best to crack down on for the last 11 years. That's one. The other thing, of course, is that if you have a mass movement of Palestinians across the border, there will be women, there will be children, there will be men who basically just want to get the hell out, but they will also likely to have Hamas members who are going to continue trying to fight Israel, except that this time they'll be doing it from someone else's sovereign territory when Israel responds it maybe into someone else's sovereign territory. So you can imagine the nightmare for that. So that's one of Egypt's red line. The new one has been the Philadelphia corridor. And Iran mentioned the sensitivity of the tunnels under that corridor for Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made several comments on wanting to move into the corridor. For Egypt, Egypt says it will contravene the treaty, and Egypt has always had a fairly stable and conservative foreign policy. It made a treaty, it sticks with it. It's been profitable for Egypt in many ways because it hasn't been fighting a war for the past 55 years, but it is very, very possible to push Egypt too far. And I think that this is something that I'm not sure whether there is an understanding of in Israel. Perhaps Iran could tell us. And again, I'm quite aware that the Israeli government isn't homogenous. There will be all sorts of different opinions, and as Iran pointed out, there will be people who were using essentially using the humanitarian situation in Rafah as a lever. It's a cruel lever, but it's not that it won't work. It is definitely the idea for most people, for most Egyptians, for the Egyptian government, of more deaths on the border, of people coming in. That idea is an extremely powerful one. And again, I don't think it's possible to overestimate the amount of the intensity of public feeling in Egypt, and the empathy with the Palestinians. And that public feeling is important for a couple of reasons. Egypt is currently undergoing a serious economic crisis, so there's a lot of discontent with a very amount of things, and it is very possible to push your public too far, as everyone found out in 2011. That's one. The other thing is you want to bear in mind that the Egyptian military, which will be the deciding factor in all of this, is not like the Syrian military, which was sectarian and therefore really didn't have too much of a problem going all out against its own people. The Egyptian military is not homogenous. It comes from a diverse slice across the entire country, and therefore it's impossible to extricate it from public opinion. Now, there is another thing. One of the questions is, how much cooperation there is and how much communication there is. That's something that I've been asking a lot. And my understanding is that the communication is constant, whether it's direct, whether it's through other parties, but the communication between the two parties is constant, because instability in Israel is not in Egypt's interest. It just isn't. Now, from what Iran says, it is also clear in Israel that instability in Egypt is not in Israel's interest. So you would imagine that would ensure tight cooperation. The thing is, matters are moving on the ground, and the Israeli government is not in any way homogenous. And you know, the internal politics of different countries will place different pressures on them. And the other thing is, I mean, the role of Egypt afterwards. People keep asking about the role of Egypt in a post-conflict Gaza. Well, first of all, it isn't clear what post-conflict Gaza is going to look like. I can tell you what Egypt and many other countries are not going to do. They are not going to be part of a peacekeeping force while there is no under an Israeli occupation, because they are not going to be complicit. They are not going to want to be seen to be complicit in an occupation. Administrative help, yes, after there is a statehood, and I realize that even discussing statehood to a lot of people, and particularly to Israelis under the current circumstances, because no one discounts the effect that this must have had on Israelis' psyche. No one. Okay, I realize that this is a long shot, but Egypt would definitely be involved in a peacekeeping mission, or in a peacekeeping capacity in Gaza, but that would be post-statehood, so it's kind of a long haul. I don't want to keep talking too long. I think if you want to keep it open for questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Mirette. At this time, I'd like to open up the discussion to all of you callers on the line. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function on Zoom. Keep your hand raised until I call on you and unmute, and then kindly state your name and affiliation, and direct your question to one or both of our scholars on the call. Questions can also be submitted in writing using the Q&A chat box on Zoom. To start things off, however, I wanted to touch on a couple of things that you said and get your comments on a couple things. The first, Mirette had mentioned, how likely is the invasion of Rafah? How likely would an invasion of Rafah result in the nullification of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt? And what would that mean for the two countries going forward? Eran, I'd love to get your opinion on it. And then Mirette, if you could provide maybe a little bit more insight into that, that'd be great.
It's a real danger. The Egyptians have been saying it, you know, from the highest levels, and I'm sure they've been also making it very clear in the more kind of discreet discussions that are ongoing bilaterally. And I'm sure they made it clear to the Americans as well. It's a primary American interest to make sure that this kind of anchor of the US regional policy since 1979 will not be hampered in any way. It's also true about Israel's national security. This is the first and most important peace agreement that we have. And as Mirette said, it's been remarkably stable, and it withstood difficult crises, including 2 wars in Lebanon and 2 intifadas and so on. So certainly if you were to ask the Israeli defense establishment or the shall we say, center-right, certainly center-left politicians in Israel, they will all agree that this is a strategic asset that must be preserved. But we have rightist and ultra-rightist politicians, some of them members of the cabinet, some of them out of the cabinet. Out of the cabinet, for example, is Avigdor Lieberman, former defense minister, who's also a far right, currently in the opposition. And within cabinet, now Smotrich and Ben Gvir became household names in essentially every policy enthusiast house everywhere in the world, unfortunately. And they certainly wouldn't mind, let's put it diplomatically, if the peace accord is jeopardized. Perhaps they would even look at it as yet another opportunity. They look at this entire quagmire as a historic opportunity for them to really create historic facts on the ground. The second Nakba in Gaza, resettlement in Gaza, and all sorts of delusions that unfortunately now have a voice in the Israeli cabinet. So while the overall Israeli interest is clear, and I think when it comes to certainly Gantz and Eisenkot within the cabinet, and even Netanyahu, I would say, they would try very hard to avoid any damage to the accord. However, things can relatively easily get out of hand. And if Israel does invade, and if there is mass population movements across the border, nobody will be able to convince the Egyptians that this is not something that Israel took into consideration. And I would almost say that their natural reaction is going to be, at least, I don't even want to speculate, but certainly in such a context, in such a scenario, it's possible that the accord will be damaged. I'll stop here.
Mirette, thank you so much, Eran, for that. Mirette, is there anything you want to add on your comments earlier?
Not very much. Only I mean, I think he's lucid on everything. I think the only thing that I would add is it is difficult to overestimate how much the Egyptians do not want to break this pact. I mean, they absolutely do not. Okay, and I think that I mean, despite things have been going back and forth. I mean, I think the Egyptian State Information Service has put out one polite and the Foreign Service has put out one polite statement after another. I think the politeness only cracked slightly when Minister Smotrich said that Egypt was responsible for what happened on October the 7th, and then the Foreign Ministry tweet was the politeness cracked along the edges slightly. So the official line is Egypt will respect that treaty as long as the treaty is respected. All right. What that means is they're in reactionary mode. They will not step forward and break anything. They will not take the first step, but they will react. They don't want to. I cannot emphasize that enough. They absolutely don't want to. And I imagine neither does anyone else, because, I mean, as Eran pointed out, this is the cornerstone treaty of this. This is why you have pretty much had a relatively peaceful region for the past 60 years. Obviously you have internal conflicts, but you don't have a region-wide war. And if the treaty is broken, I don't really even want to speculate on what that would mean for the region. I think it's just it's an extremely dangerous and extremely ugly scenario. I think one that the Israeli military establishment is fully aware of. And I think if you're looking for the risk of sounding flippant, the grown-ups in the room, that would be them. So I do think that the thing that you cannot judge, the wild card here, is Israel's internal politics, because nobody can judge that. So I think the situation is actually significantly more serious than people think.
That's great. Thank you both for that. I have a question in the chat here that I also agree with. I think it's almost the elephant in the room here. Mirette, you talked about Egypt's red line being letting Palestinians into Egypt for fear that if Palestinians enter Egypt, they will never be allowed back into Gaza. Eran, I'd love your comments on what do you think that is a reality, that if Palestinians enter Egypt, they will never be allowed back into Gaza? And Mirette, at what point does Egypt become responsible from an international law perspective to accept Palestinian refugees into Egypt if a war was to break out? I'd love both of your perspectives on that.
I want to say that I'm having a very hard time imagining such a scenario where, you know, a significant number has crossed and then it would not be allowed back. I can't say it's completely impossible, but if you ask me how realistic this is, how probable, you know, I would say below 10% probability. What was the second part of the question?
Well, the second part of the question is more at what point does Egypt become responsible from an international law perspective to accept Palestinian refugees?
I'm not sure it's an important question, let's put it this way, because that's not going to be the determining factor. Egypt will do whatever it can, and there's a lot it can do, to avoid such an eventuality. And again, I'm sure Mirette will be able to expand, but they will never accept a significant number of Palestinian refugees permanently. It's simply out of the question. All one needs to do is look at, you know, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, wherever, refugees from previous incarnations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. None of them has been naturalized, and there's simply no way that Egypt will naturalize a large number of Palestinians, large numbers of Palestinians, simply out of the question. That would be my assessment.
Great. Mirette, do you agree with Iran's assessment that it's a low likelihood that Palestinians won't be allowed back into Gaza? And at what point and what responsibility does Egypt play in this humanitarian situation?
Okay, so I absolutely cannot speak for the likelihood of Palestinians being allowed into Gaza, because that's an entirely Israeli decision. The only thing that we have to go on is 3.5 million Palestinian refugees that are still languishing in refugee camps, as you said, around the world. They haven't been naturalized, but they're not going to be allowed back into Israel either. So that's the situation. Egypt will do absolutely.
If I can just interject momentarily, I would say that, as I'm sure you remember, in the course of previous peace negotiations, their return to the state of Palestine or to the West Bank and Gaza was negotiated with Israeli agreement. So it's not as if they're, they're destined, as far as Israel is concerned, to remain outside of the boundaries of Israel-Palestine forever.
My understanding is that they can't go back. If there's something that I'm missing, I would be.
No, right now, of course not. I'm saying in the context of peace agreements, of peace
Right.
negotiations
So
in the past.
Yes, if we get, yes, absolutely. If we get a peace agreement, great, then there won't be this misery. But it is a big if. Okay.
Yeah.
So there is that now. And it's not just a matter of refugees. I mean, Egypt currently hosts about 9.5 million refugees. It's almost 10% of the population. It's specifically Palestinians for this reason. All right. Now, there is, however, there is what you want to do, and there is real life. In the eventuality, if the Egyptian state does everything it can and people still come across the border, you are not going to get in a situation, as far as I can see, you are not going to get a situation where the Egyptian military is going to start shooting women and children coming across the border. That's not going to happen. All right. But they don't want it to happen because, like I said, they're not worried about women and children. They're worried about the conflict being brought over into Egypt and about mass expulsion. So that's, I mean, the question about their responsibility, that there isn't a responsibility unless they are in Egypt, and even then, I mean, it's very, very fuzzy. I mean, there are, I mean, the number of Eastern European countries you can think of that have had refugees not even wanting to settle, just trying to move their way across to get to Germany, for example. the treatment that we have seen there indicates that, international law is perhaps fuzzy on what the rights of a person are if they are in a country illegally, because that's really what a refugee is. It's someone who has, for whatever reason, had to leave their home and be in someone else's home. And then what are your responsibilities for that? So responsibility, I don't know. But in real life, my educated guess would be, if people come across the border, the Egyptian military is not going to start shooting at women and children.
All right, thank you both for your insight. It's obviously a very difficult situation. We have another question in the chat here. And this is for both of you, how do you assess Egypt's actions and messaging on this crisis to date?
Messaging in what terms?
Messaging in the ways in which they've negotiated with Israel, and the ways in which they've communicated their priorities and their red lines, both to Israel and I think to the international community more broadly.
I can start. I think they did a good job. I think it's very clear to all parties, including to Israel, what are their red lines, what are their priorities, what are their concerns, and so on. In that respect, they did a good job. I think it's much clearer where they stand, much more clear than, for example, where Israel stands in terms of the overall strategy in Gaza. Where I think they do have kind of an Achilles heel, it's the issue of the tunnels underneath Philadelphia, because their position is really, how shall we put it diplomatically, not very strong. To continue kind of adamantly denying that there is any kind of movement under the Philadelphia corridor runs against too many known facts. And while Israel so far did not go all the way in terms of exposing what Israel knows about what actually goes on there, for good reasons, the Egyptians know that Israel knows. The Egyptians know that the Americans know. And essentially, everybody knows that the border is not sealed. So when Egypt continues to insist that it is 100% sealed, it is exposing itself in what I think is not necessarily a smart way. However, there are ongoing contacts, discussions about a big project financed by the UAE, if I understand correctly, to erect a subterranean wall that alleged with sensors and so on of the type that Israel has built between itself and Gaza, that might be able to block by technological and physical means any kind of tunnel, hopefully. And if indeed such a project is part of the overall understandings, agreements between Israel, the Egyptians, the new Palestinian Authority in Gaza, the Americans, and so on, then this will be a welcomed outcome of all of this. But generally speaking, I think they have done a good job.
Mirette, anything you'd like to add?
I actually think that covered a lot of it. I can't speak to the tunnels. My understanding is that because it's in the interest of the Egyptians to seal those tunnels, because the weapons go both ways. Make no mistake, the Egyptians do not want those tunnels open to have weapons coming into Egypt. They don't need that. So, but I do know that there is discussion with, I think, the Emiratis to try and make them even more secure. It's a different discussion as to what happened on October the 7th was all the result of this. I think it's now becoming clear that many of those weapons were purloined from the Israeli side in the first place, but it's not something I'm an expert on, so I don't really want to speak to that because I'm not sure. But I think, as Eran said, they have been very clear on what they want and what they don't want. They've sort of stuck their heels in and said, this is what's happening as far as we're concerned. This is what's not going to happen as far as we're concerned. So there's really not very much wiggle room. Egypt will be delighted to do anything diplomatically that it can do because it absolutely wants to avoid more bloodshed, more. I mean, the situation right at the beginning, Egypt, and along with everyone else, but Egypt was worried that this situation would spiral out of control. It already has. I mean, the Suez Canal has been hit very badly by what's happening in the Red Sea, and you know, it absolutely doesn't want a conflagration on its borders again. So it's in its interests to have this solved, and it's in a good position to try it to mediate on it. But other than that, I think it has been very clear on what they can put up with and what they can't put up with. And I think again with Egypt, in this particular case, if it says it can't do something, then you probably want to think that it can't do it.
That's good. Before we wrap, there's
Just
one
Sorry. Finger
yes,
on that.
please.
I think there's kind of a conventional wisdom in Israel amongst the professional echelons that while in terms of high policy, as Mirette said, the Egyptians do not want those tunnels to be open, and their official policy and their actual policy is to prevent it. But as so often is the case in a lot of military establishments, there's a difference between kind of the higher echelons and what actually takes place on the ground. So on that level, probably because of kind of tactical failures, personal issues of the last person next to the border or whatnot, things maybe are not aligned on the ground with the official policy of Cairo.
Right, thank you for that. Before we wrap, we have one more question here asking about domestic popular opinion in both countries. I know, Mirette, you said sort of domestic popular opinion is really plays a big role in the heterogeneous Egyptian military. Eran, you've talked a little bit about what the opinion is inside Israel, but if you guys could provide a little bit of comment on that before we wrap, that'd be great.
This is the opinion concerning the overall situation, or specifically Rafah, or what?
Specifically Rafah, and maybe a little bit, beyond.
Right. So, unfortunately, Israeli public opinion is completely traumatized. It's not even post-traumatic, it's still traumatized. And it is very negatively affected by the October 7th massacre and everything that happened on that date and after that date. People lost some of their very basic sense of security, and it has a direct impact on their opinions and views in terms of what Israel should and should not do, and what the Palestinians actually want. And it's all pointing in a negative direction. So the government, first of all, in and of itself, believes in kind of taking a very, shall we say, militant approach towards Gaza and towards Hamas to restore deterrence, to eradicate, to prevent any kind of future capability to launch attacks against Israel and so on. And the public opinion is pretty much with the government on that. And so it's this kind of chicken and an egg thing. And there is much more of an inclination by the Israeli public opinion to continue the war until Hamas is defeated completely, rather than, for example, opt for a quick diplomatic solution. The only kind of outlier or caveat to that is the issue of the hostages. And if indeed, something that I personally hope, there will be a quick breakthrough and at least an initial agreement on hostages for prisoners and ceasefire exchange, temporary ceasefire. Not that it will be put to any kind of a referendum in Israel, but I'm quite sure that the polls in this case would show that most Israelis would say yes. It will not be, by the way, an overwhelming majority, but it will be a majority. And it's an open question, what will the cabinet decision be on this? I think there's going to be a very hot debate, and maybe the actual vote might be pretty close between those who will say yes, those who will say no, and those who will abstain.
That's great. Thanks so much for that analysis. Mirette, can you speak at all to Egyptian public opinion before we go?
So I think we've already said Egyptian public opinion. I mean, so it isn't that nuanced. As far as Egyptian public opinion is concerned, you have two issues. And I think one, there is, as I said, overwhelming empathy for the Palestinians. But there's also, and this is something that is not just in Egypt, but is rippling, I think, through, I mean, everywhere really that isn't the West. There is a feeling that Palestinian suffering is being treated differently from, let's say, Ukrainian suffering. Bear in mind, this has nothing to do with whether this is right or wrong, or, whether Israel is acting proportionately or not proportionately, or defending itself or not, has nothing to do with that. There is, I think, in addition to the empathy for the suffering of the Palestinians, there is, I think, a creeping anger at what is perceived to be an imbalance in the way this suffering, brown, if you like, not white, not European, is being treated compared to what people were expected to feel, let's say, for the Ukrainian refugees, which is ridiculous because suffering is suffering. But it isn't ridiculous in that there has definitely been a difference in the way this has been covered and this has been covered. That's a very, very long, very different conversation, but that's basically what you're looking at. Overwhelming anger and empathy. Doesn't mean everyone wants to go to war. No, they don't, okay? But overwhelming anger and empathy. And that just means that the Egyptian government has to be extra careful with the decisions that it takes. It's still going to do what it feels is in the interest of the country, which is long-term stability, but it does place, it does place extra pressure on it to, if you like, present all decisions in such a way as to tamp down on that public anger.
That's great. Thank you for that. At this time, we're going to wrap things up. But if you have any more questions, please email them to me. I'd be happy to send them along to Eran and Mirette to answer at a later time. I hope you'll all thank me in joining me and thanking Eran and Mirette for participating in this week's session. We really value robust conversations about difficult topics, and I think today was a great example of that. So thank you both for participating in today's discussion. I really appreciate it. I know our listeners do too. If you've missed any of our sessions or wish to watch them again, you can find recordings and transcripts of all our briefings on our landing page, www.mei.edu/briefing-series. That's www.mei.edu/briefing-series. Thanks again for joining us for this week's session, and please be on the lookout for an email invitation to next week's briefing in the coming days. If you can find these calls valuable and want to learn more about other resources MEI has to provide, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to connect and tell you more about all that. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today, and I wish you a great rest of your day.